In this lecture, I will be talking about the text, the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. In the last lecture, I spoke about the history of English literature, where I made a mention of a pre-Chaucerian period in which several texts were written, and I also gave a very brief introduction to you about those books. I hope you have already gone through the study material that has been provided to you. I would now like to begin with a brief introduction to Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English literature. He was an English poet and he was writing in the medieval times. You can see the timeline is 1340 to 1400. So which century is it? Correct, it is the 14th century. So he has to his credit a number of books. He was a prolific writer. Besides the Canterbury Tales, he has written the Book of the Duchess, the House of Fame, Annalida and Arcite, the Parliament of Fowls. So, as we talk about Chaucer, we should know that he has immensely contributed to the English literature. If we look at the age of Chaucer, the age of Chaucer can be divided into three groups: the French period, the Italian period, and the English period. If you remember, in the last lecture, I told you that Latin and French were supposed to be the language of the scholars. So most of the intellectual writings had a lot of influence of these two languages, and slowly and gradually, in the old and the Middle Ages, the language of English emerged. So one thing should be very clear to you in the beginning, that the English that you will come across in the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales does not read like the spellings or the pronunciation of the words that you are familiar with in these times. And the only reason behind that is because that is the English of the medieval times. So Latin used to be the language of the educated people. It was only after the Norman conquest that French was introduced. While Latin was basically used for religious matters, French used to be the medium for interaction between the commoners. While reading the Canterbury Tales, you will find that the tales have been written in a very conversational tone. All the similes, comparisons, metaphors that are used in Chaucer's poetry are taken from the common spheres of life. Here I would like to again remind you the observations by W.H. Hudson, who says that every man belongs to his race and age. No matter how marked his personality, the spirit of his race and age finds an expression through him. So this is what you will see in the writings of Chaucer and the text that we have to take up, the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So it is not wrong if we say, whether it is Shakespeare or Chaucer, that they do not, it is quite true about them that they don't belong to an age, they belong to all ages. But then it is also not wrong to say that they were such prolific writers, genius people, but they could also not escape the influence of the spirit of the age. So this 14th century in the history of English literature is also referred to as the age of Chaucer. I spoke about the ages in my previous lecture. So it is time now to move on. What was this 14th century like? And why is it important for us to know about the 14th century? Because we have to read the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. And in order to understand what the characters are talking about, because there are a number of characters in the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, which have been very realistically portrayed by Geoffrey Chaucer. So the age of Chaucer brings poetry closer to nature and reality. He has made use of a very humane vision in order to portray the life, whether it is the knight, the squire, the monk, the friar, the partner, the nun, priest, or anyone else in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So he also is expressing, a very modern outlook on life. Now here you need to understand, though Chaucer belonged to the 14th century and it was the medieval times in those days, but it was a transitional phase. So what happens in the transitional phase? It will be characterized by features or the prominent features that mark the medieval times, and also a few features, which were gaining momentum or which were gaining currency in the times to come, that is the modern times or the times after that. So, if Chaucer is referred to as the morning star of English literature, the medieval time or the 14th century is also referred to as the dawn of the Renaissance and the Reformation. I hope by now you have read a few things about what Renaissance was and what Reformation was. It is very essential for you to know about these words beforehand. So, the medieval times, so the times he was writing in was a mix of the medieval and the modern. So, what kind of temper do you expect, would characterize the medieval times? You guessed it right. The medieval times were marked by superstitions, chivalrous, religious-minded attitude, backwardness, or some kind of unscientific facts that were quite dominant in the society. So, J.M. Manley, in his book, The Cambridge History of English Literature, remarks that 14th century was a dark epoch. It was a dark time for England. But there was a silver lining to it as well. And what was that silver lining? The modern outlook on life, which Chaucer has very well expressed in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So while it was the medieval times, it was also the dawn of Renaissance and Reformation. So Robert Dudley, French, observes it was an age of restlessness. This is what he's commenting about the medieval times. Amid the ferment of new life that Chaucer lived and wrote, all things and new appear side by side upon his pages, and in his poetry we can study the essential spirit both of the age that was passing and of the age that was to come. So, I would just like to bring your attention to the word restlessness that Robert Dudley French makes an observation about. Now, what was this restlessness about? Now, the period 1337 to 1453 in the history of England was marked by 100 years of war. Though Chaucer is presenting in a very realistic manner all that he was keenly observing in his society, in the community that he was living, the true cross currents, medievalism and modernism, the theological ideas and the intellectual expansion that was taking place is very well framed within the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. You need to know that this was not a pleasant phase in the history of English literature. Already told you that J.M. Manley has remarked and observed that it was a dark epoch in the history of England. So, this period between 1337 and 53 was marked by a long succession of skirmish accounts between France and England, which were collectively known as the 100 Years' War. Now, what was happening in the war? There was something, a blessing in disguise that happened, and it was due to this persistent, constant 100 years of war, a sense of nationalism got fostered in the people. There was a total demolition of social barriers between the classes. So, Another critic, Compton Rickett, reminds us that this time was marked by a nationalistic spirit, a national solidarity, and a patriotic fervor. And this nationalism and the democratization that took place during that time was due to the contribution not only of the aristocracy but also of the common man, the working class, or the common people. They provided a very vital support during this war. This age was also an age. Which age? The age of Chaucer, 14th century, was the age of chivalry. I would like to put it in the words of Compton Rickett. Chaucer's England is still characteristically medieval, and nowhere is the conservative feeling more strongly marked than in the persistence of the chivalry. This strange amalgam of love, war, and religion, so far from exhibiting any signs of decay, reached perhaps its fullest development during this time. More than 2 centuries were to elapse before it was finally killed by the satirical pen of Cervantes. So we know that this was the age of courage, that is the age of chivalry. So if you are asked a question like this, Chaucer is a representative of his age. In that, dealing with this kind of a question, you would require to put in all that I have already spoken. Additionally, now you know that there were two cross currents of medievalism and modernism that are quite strikingly marked in his writings. So this is something, which you need to be very careful about as you read the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So you will find in the prologue all that I have just spoken, the kind of rise of nationalism that was taking place, the rise of peasantry, the kind of British Parliament that was coming up, the stories of the pilgrims and the reformist movements. Now, during this time, I just spoke about the rise of nationalism, which happened because of the 100 Years of War. There was also a rise of peasantry. There were a lot of peasant movements. And what was the reason for that? Again, there was a labor unrest because of which this kind of thing was happening. So it was a time of unrest because of the labor unrest. Can you guess what kind of things would have happened at that moment which would have led to the labor unrest? Just now I told you that some unscientific thoughts, orthodoxy, religious mindedness marked the medieval times in England. This age of Chaucer was also a time when most of the people were victims of poverty, squalor, and pestilence. Please, pestilence. I hope you know what pestilence is. Disease, right? So this was the time when in 1348, Black Death. Students of history might be very well knowing what this Black Death and what is the significance of this year, 1348. It was the time, when these even well-educated nobles, physicians, they forbade bathing. They thought it is harmful for health. And England was frequently visited by epidemics, especially the plague in 1348. So which is also referred to as the Black Death. It was a time, when people started developing these black knotty boils that appeared on their bodies, and they became hapless victims of Black Death. So there was a lot of pestilence, disease, and people. As a consequence, what would happen? There was a shortage of the working hands. And when there was a shortage of the working hands, what happened? What followed was the socio-economic system of England was paralyzed. So when the socio-economic system gets paralyzed, what will happen? There will be a discontentment at every level. So there were a number of regulations that were passed to ensure that the workers should get good rates or payment for the jobs that they were rendering. But this culminated, people were not given the wages. So this culminated in a revolt, the peasant revolt in 1381. And this was during the reign of Richard I. So the peasants were groaning about the injustice that was happening, the dignity of labor that was not being observed properly. So they asked the nobles, I would just try to read this quote, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? So though the king, Richard I, was moved by the peasantry, they were armed with weapons, spades, pitchforks, he promised some reforms to them, but these promises were not kept. So what happened? Compton Rickett again observes, the peasant revolt was a dim foreshadowing of the industrial troubles that lay in the distant future. R.K. Root, another historian, observes that this revolt, suppressed by courage and good judgment, again, gave rise to a kind of spirit of independence which could not be ignored. So this is all about the kind of the rise of peasantry that took place in those days. Again, the political scenes and the people who were ruling at that moment, they were also quite, the shape and contours of the political life was also greatly changing. In addition to this, there was something that was happening in the religious corridors as well. So what was happening was that the church was also associated with certain corrupt and materialistic practices. And this is what we will come to know through the story of the pilgrims who are visiting, who are in the Tabard Inn, right? In the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So there are a lot of reformist movements that had to take place because of this kind of corruption and materialism that was dominating in the churches. W.H. Hudson, in the context of the corruption that was taking place in the churches, observes, of spiritual zeal and energy very little was now left in the country. The greater prelates heaped up wealth and lived in a godless and a worldly way. Now, do you expect the priests to live in a godless and a worldly way? No. But what was happening? The rank and file of the clergy were ignorant and careless. The mendicant friars were notorious for their greed and profligacy. So this is something which we are going to read in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, in all the characters, whether it was the monk, friar, summoner, pardoner, prioress, they were all fun-loving, pleasure-loving people. And this was quite contrary to what the church said. It is not only Chaucer who made remarks or realistically showed this class of society in his prologue to the Canterbury Tales. There were many contemporary writers who were equally talking about how the priests were dark and beclouded, and there was neither a shaven crown on their head, nor modesty in their words, nor temperance in their food, nor even chastity in their deeds. So they were losing the kind of virtues which should be quite common to the people from the religious field. Therefore, some kind of reformist movements were also taking shape. So, it is quite appropriate to say that Chaucer's age, like most of the historical ages, was an age of transition which was marked by a medievalism and a modernism. What was happening after 1320 was a kind of reformation which John Cliff, the morning star of reformation, started a movement called the Lollards movement. You have to remember this. There is no direct mention of these movements in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, but you will see that, sorry, I'll write this side. It's not visible there. All right, this is Lollards movement. So, you will find some kind of references here and there in whatever Chaucer has to write about the characters of the time. In addition to all this, there also has been a development of the language, and it would not be wrong if we say that Chaucer, though was writing poetry, had a style which could be considered, he could be considered as a precursor to the dramatic writings or the novel writings. Why? Because the way, the style in which he has portrayed the characters, represented them, is something that you usually find in a novel. But he has been able to do that. There is a proper plot. There are a number of characters that he talks about in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So, by now, you know that it was the Great Plague, the Black Death, the unsettling rebellion, the 100 Years of War, the corruption in the church, and the developments in the parliament, and this characterized the society of the age of Chaucer, the 14th century. So, what you will read in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales is about the pilgrims, and the pilgrimage is taken to the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, Kent in England, and they are in the Tabard Inn when they the host decides that each one will be telling a story. So you will find that all these people in this prologue belong to different professions. I would like to add here, because of Chaucer's experience of working with a variety of people, was he able to portray a number of characters, It's very difficult. Usually you would find in any writings, say 5, 6 or 10. But I will not tell you the count. I would like you to count with me as I move on to the next slide. So people from different professions, and this writing also will talk about certain myths and legends that were prevalent at that time. If we talk about the plot of Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, the list is very long, and I expect you to read it by the next time so that we can discuss some of this, right? So you have the Knight's Tale. I will not tell you how many characters are these, but I just keep numbering these so that you get a number and a count of how many characters were there in this prologue. So he begins with the Knight's Tale, the Miller's Tale, Reeve's Tale, Cook's Tale, Man of Law's Tale, Shipman's Tale, Prior's Tale, Rhyme of Sir Thomas, Tale of Meliboeus, the Monk's Tale, the Nun's Priest's Tale, Physician's Tale, Pardoner's Tale, Wife of Bath's Tale, Friars, the Summoner's Tale, the Clerk's Tale, the Merchant's Tale, the Squire's Tale, the Franklin's Tale, the Second Nun's Tale, Canon Yeoman's Tale, the Manciple's Tale, the Parson's Tale. Okay, so We reached to 24, right? But we will talk about more in the next lecture, because they were not 24 but 29 plus 1, the host, a total of host at the Tabard Inn, a 30 characters that are being talked about by Chaucer in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So William Blake makes an observation: Chaucer's characters live age after age. Every age is a Canterbury pilgrimage. So the Canterbury Tales, which Chaucer is bringing before us from people of different strata of the society, is something that I would be talking about in the next lecture. So I expect from you that you should be reading the tales so that we can carry out the character analysis and also talk about the realistic elements and other prominent features in the writing of Chaucer with reference to the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Thank you very much.